This presentation is on the theory of evolution and natural selection. By the end of this PowerPoint, you should be able to account for the appearance of a novel trait that arose in a given population, recognize how heritable characteristics can strongly influence how likely an individual is to survive and reproduce, and describe how evolution involves changes in the genetic makeup of whole populations over time, not changes in the genes of an individual organism. So, a theory is a statement that explains a set of observations. And evolution is a change in a population over time. So we're going to talk about a brief history of the observations that led to the theory of evolution as we know it today. So Lamarck was the first to propose a mechanism by which populations change over time. He hypothesized that organisms change during their lifetime, then pass that trait on. So for example, he thought that giraffes would stretch their necks out because they wanted to reach leaves that were higher on the trees, and in doing so, their necks would grow longer during their lifetime. Another example is in observing flamingos. He thought that they would stretch their legs up because they didn't want to get their bodies wet when wading in the water, and that their legs would grow longer. And then they would be able to pass that trait on to their offspring. Unfortunately, he was wrong about that, because remember that all traits are coded for in the DNA. All traits are passed on from parent to offspring through DNA, not through an acquired characteristic. An acquired characteristic during a lifetime would be, a good example would be a scar. And a scar is not something that's passed on through DNA. Then Malthus came about, and he said that human population increases exponentially. So as you can see on the graph, we have the human population line in green increasing exponentially. Then he said that the food supply increased linearly. And this is the food supply line. And at some point, there's going to become a time where there's not enough food to feed the population. But what Malthus said was that famine, war, and disease basically kept the population down and prevented us from ever reaching this point where the food supply was met by population. But Darwin did apply this idea to populations, in the idea that populations had to fight for food. And if an individual could not get food, it was less able to survive and therefore less able to reproduce and pass on its DNA. But before we get more into that, I just want to talk about the idea of fossils. A fossil is a trace of a long dead organism. And the law of superposition says that subsequent layers of rock and soil were deposited on top of each other. So that means that the oldest fossils are going to be found at the bottom, and the newer fossils are going to be found at the top. Cuvier thought that species change suddenly based on the fossil record, but Hutton and Lyell interpreted the data differently because of the idea of uniformitarianism. And this states that the same kind of forces that are operating today on Earth have always operated on Earth. So things like erosion and weathering are affecting rocks and are affecting whether or not an organism becomes fossilized. So something you have to understand is that not all organisms become fossilized. It takes a very specific set of steps to get an organism to be fossilized. So Hutton and Lyell use this idea to say, Well, just because there's a gap in the fossil record, or just because there's a sudden change from this fossil to this fossil, doesn't necessarily mean that the organisms changed suddenly. It might just mean that the organisms were not fossilized and the evidence is not available. They also were able to prove that the Earth was really, really old. And at the time, when Darwin started studying evolution, he was reading Lyell's book while on the HMS Beagle and was interested in Lyell's ideas. So Charles Darwin was born in 1809 and died in 1882. He was the son of a wealthy British physician. He ended up getting a job on the HMS Beagle as a naturalist. The Beagle went on a 5-year expedition. Their main job was to map and collect specimens from South America and the South Pacific. As a naturalist, Darwin's job was to collect the specimens and keep careful records of his observations. And one of the places that they stopped was the Galapagos Islands. And something that Darwin noticed and observed, and what ultimately was able to help him come to his final ideas on evolution, was the idea that a species had migrated from the mainland to the Galapagos Islands here. And that species gradually changed to meet their needs and to meet what was available on that island. Then some of those, so they changed to species B. Then some of those species migrated on to the next island. And based on what was available on that island, they changed to a different species. And then that species migrated to different islands and changed slightly, and so on and so forth. So what he noticed was that the species were changing to adjust to the environment. And here we have a perfect example. He used finches. So the original South American warbler finch from the mainland here had a beak that looked like this, and it was an insect eater. So what he noticed was that all of the finches, their beaks had changed ever so slightly according to what was most available on the island that they were on. So small insectivorous tree finches had a very similar beak to the original, whereas the finches that had to get their insects from cactus grew thicker, hardier, but still pointy beaks. He observed that finches that were on an island that had mainly seeds had grown also different beaks, and that finally finches that were mainly fruit eaters, because that's what was available on the island, had also different beaks. So after he made all of his observations and collected all of his data, Darwin went home and he studied his data for a very, very long time. And the reason for this was because he was scared. During his time, they firmly believed that organisms did not change over time. And they also believed that the earth did not change. And they believed this because they were very much into religion, and they believed that God put things on the planet the way that he had planned, and that although organisms could die off, organisms did not change. God had designed them the way he wanted them, and that's the way they were. So by coming out and saying his theory on evolution, he was basically going against God, and this is why he was pretty afraid. But in 1858, a man named Wallace approached Darwin with his findings on evolution. So he had also come up with ideas on evolution. And later in 1858, Darwin and Wallace presented their papers together to fellow scientists. And those fellow scientists said, yeah, that kind of makes sense. So in 1859, Darwin finally published his book on the origin of species by means of natural selection. So what I would like you to do is, based on what I've said and what has been in the presentation, to create your own definition of evolution. And then I'd like you to give an example of an organism that I did not talk about that has inherited a trait that would help it survive in its environment. And you can use any animal in the wild. Then I would like you to explain if an organism during its lifetime can evolve, and then I'd like you to explain why or why not. And now I'd like to quickly go through the steps of natural selection. So you should be able to account for the appearance of a novel trait that arose in a given population. Recognize how heritable characteristics can strongly influence how likely an individual is to survive and reproduce. And then describe how evolution involves changes in the genetic makeup of whole populations over time, not changes in the genes of an individual organism. So first, you need to understand what a population is. And a population is a group of organisms of the same species that live in a specific geographical area and can interbreed. So if there is a population of wolves in North America and a population of wolves in Russia, they're not considered to be the same population because they are not in the same geographical area and therefore do not interbreed. They may be the same species, but they are not the same population. A species is a group of organisms that are closely related and can mate to produce fertile offspring. So back to the wolf example, if I get a wolf from North America and I get a wolf from Russia, they are able to reproduce and create fertile offspring, so they are considered the same species. In biology, specifically evolution, fitness is the ability to successfully reproduce. So an organism that reproduces more and has more offspring is considered more fit than an organism that does not produce more offspring. Doesn't matter if they're faster, doesn't matter if they're stronger. What matters here is their ability to reproduce and pass on their genetic information to their offspring. So Darwin's theory of natural selection has 4 steps. The first step is overproduction. Overproduction just says that every species makes more individuals than are able to survive to maturity, meaning that some are going to die, but more individuals than can survive are produced. The second step is variation. Among those that are produced, there is variation. The individuals of a population have different characteristics, and as you can see here among these elk, they're different colors. Or perhaps they have different fur thicknesses. The third step is selection. The environment will select for a more positive characteristic. So some of those organisms that were overproduced will die due to their specific variation. Perhaps their fur was not thick enough to survive the cold weather. And lastly, the fourth step is adaptation. The traits of those individuals that survive and reproduce will become more common in a population. Because the other organisms died out, and these organisms were able to survive, they're able to reproduce. They are more fit. So they're able to reproduce, they make more offspring, and they pass on their characteristics, while the other organisms don't. And that is how a species changes over time. And that is the mechanism of evolution.